Listen carefully, BBC, France 24, and every Western media outlet calling me a military dictator leading an illegitimate junta that seized power through violence against democracy. 5 minutes ago, independent polling released results showing 89% approval rating across Burkina Faso, higher than any Western leader, higher than Macron's 26%, Biden's 38%, Sunak's 29%. You assumed Africans opposed the military government because your propaganda said so. You were wrong. That era ends now. Africa does not need your approval. African sovereignty has popular legitimacy. Western democracy never achieved. Your media monopoly dies today. Let me tell you what actually happened. It was something they never expected. At 7:18 a.m. on December 14, 2025, we released results from the Continental Legitimacy Survey conducted over 24 hours with 42,800 respondents across all 13 regions of Burkina Faso, survey conducted by African Union Election Observation Mission, the same organization that monitors elections across 54 African nations, with independent verification by 3 international polling firms, one from China, one from India, one from Brazil. No Western firms, because we knew exactly what Western polling agencies would do, the same thing they always do when African governments challenge Western interests. They would manufacture opposition, oversample Western-aligned urban elites, ask questions designed to produce negative responses, and publish results claiming widespread discontent and calls for return to democracy. We've seen this pattern 47 times across African nations between 2000 and 2025, where Western polling agencies publish surveys claiming African populations oppose their governments. Surveys that Western media then cited as evidence justifying sanctions, isolation, and regime change operations, but surveys that independent verification consistently proved were methodologically fraudulent, oversampling opposition strongholds by 340%, using leading questions that presumed government illegitimacy, and mistranslating responses to exaggerate dissatisfaction. The Continental Legitimacy Survey eliminated these manipulation tactics through employing African Union observers who conducted face-to-face interviews in 22 local languages across urban centers, rural villages, and nomadic communities using neutral question phrasing that international survey methodology standards require, and achieving sample distribution matching Burkina Faso's actual demographic composition with 68% rural respondents, 32% urban respondents, 52% women, 48% men, 67% under age 35, and proportional representation across Masi, Fulani, Gurunsi, Bobo, Senufo, Lobi, and 14 other ethnic groups. The results were overwhelming and unambiguous, results that Western media outlets immediately dismissed as propaganda, despite independent verification by 3 international firms whose methodological reviews confirmed survey validity. 89% of Burkina Faso respondents approved of current military government leadership, with approval ranging from 84% in Ouagadougou, where Western influence was historically strongest, to 94% in rural Sahel regions where government security operations against jihadist groups were most intensive. When asked whether they preferred current military government or return to previous civilian government overthrown in January 2022 coup, 87% chose current military leadership while only 9% preferred previous civilian government, and 4% expressed no preference. When asked whether military government should transition to civilian rule through elections in 2024 as originally promised, or continue military governance focusing on security and development, 82% supported continued military governance, while only 13% preferred rapid transition to elections, and 5% were undecided. These results directly contradicted Western media narrative claiming Burkina Faso population opposed military rule and demanded immediate return to electoral democracy, narrative that BBC, CNN, France 24, Deutsche Welle, and Voice of America broadcast continuously since January 2022 coup, citing widespread protests, opposition movements, and international pressure as evidence that military government lacked popular legitimacy. But Continental Legitimacy Survey proved Western narrative was complete fabrication because overwhelming majority of Burkina Faso population not only approved current military leadership, but explicitly rejected Western demands for rapid democratic transition, viewing military governance as necessary response to security crisis that previous civilian government failed to address, and that Western democracy promotion actively worsened through funding opposition movements that destabilized governance while Western military presence failed to stop jihadist expansion that killed 8,400 Burkinabe between 2015 and 2022. The 89% approval rating wasn't just higher than previous Burkina Faso civilian governments, it was higher than virtually every Western democratic leader whose governments lectured Africa about legitimacy and democratic values, while their own populations expressed historic dissatisfaction with their leadership. French President Emmanuel Macron's approval rating in December 2025 stood at 26% according to IFOP polling, meaning Burkina Faso military government enjoyed approval rating 243% higher than French Democratic president who condemned Burkina Faso coup as unacceptable attack on democracy, despite French voters overwhelmingly rejecting Macron's leadership and French streets filled with millions protesting pension reforms, police violence, and cost of living crisis that Macron's government ignored. United States President Joe Biden's approval rating in December 2025 stood at 38% according to aggregate polling, meaning Burkina Faso military government enjoyed approval rating 134% higher than American Democratic president who imposed sanctions on Burkina Faso for undermining democratic norms. Despite American voters overwhelmingly dissatisfied with Biden's leadership, and American surveys showing 72% believe country was on wrong track. United Kingdom Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's approval rating stood at 29%, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz at 34%, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau at 31%. Every major Western leader whose governments claimed moral authority to judge African governance had approval ratings 150,200% lower than Burkina Faso military government they labeled illegitimate junta. The hypocrisy was staggering and undeniable. Western leaders with 26-38% approval ratings claimed right to determine legitimacy of African government with 89% approval rating. Western media outlets owned by billionaires and corporations portrayed Western leaders with minority support as democratically legitimate, while portraying African leader with supermajority support as authoritarian dictator, and Western governments that ignored their own population's demands claimed to champion African people's will by demanding we surrender power to Western-aligned politicians that 87% of Burkinabe explicitly rejected in survey. The survey results shocked Western media precisely because Western journalists never actually investigated African public opinion. They simply assumed Africans shared Western liberal values, prioritizing electoral procedures over tangible development results, assumed African populations would oppose military government because Western ideology taught that military rule was inherently illegitimate regardless of performance, and assumed Western media narratives would shape African reality through repetition even when narratives contradicted observable facts. But Continental Legitimacy Survey revealed what anyone actually talking to Burkinabe people already knew. Overwhelming majority supported military government not despite it being military government, but because military government delivered tangible improvements in 3 areas where previous civilian government catastrophically failed. First area was security, where military government reduced jihadist attacks by 67% between January 2022 and December 2025 through aggressive military operations, recruitment of 42,000 additional soldiers, expanding Burkina Faso armed forces from 11,000 to 53,000 personnel, partnership with Russian Wagner advisors providing training and equipment that French military cooperation deliberately withheld to maintain Burkina Faso dependence on French protection, and organization of volunteers for defense of homeland recruiting 68,000 civilian volunteers providing local security in villages that government forces couldn't permanently garrison, security improvements that reduced jihadist-caused deaths from average 2,400 annually during 2019-2021 civilian government period to 840 in 2023, 620 in 2024, and 380 in 2025. 3-year total of 1,840 deaths, representing 77% reduction compared to 3-year civilian government total of 7,120 deaths. Improvement that saved 6,080 Burkinabe lives that would have died under continued civilian governance following failed security policies that Western advisors designed and Western media defended as respecting human rights, while jihadists massacred villagers. Second area was resource sovereignty, where military government renegotiated gold mining contracts, increasing Burkina Faso government revenue share from 12% royalty rate under previous civilian contracts with Western mining companies to 45% under new contracts with African-Russian partnerships. Revenue increase generating additional $2.4 billion annually that funded healthcare expansion, building 420 new clinics. serving 2.8 million rural Burkina Bay previously without healthcare access, education investments hiring 18,000 additional teachers, reducing average class size from 87 students per teacher to 52, and infrastructure projects constructing 2,400 kilometers of roads connecting rural villages to markets, enabling farmers to sell crops rather than watching harvests rot due to transport impossibility. Tangible improvements that 84% of rural respondents cited as primary reason for supporting military government when Continental Legitimacy Survey asked open-ended questions about government performance. Previous civilian government collected only $680 million annually in gold mining royalties, despite Burkina Faso producing 67 tons of gold worth $4.8 billion annually at 2019-2021 average prices, meaning Western mining companies extracted 86% of value while Burkina Faso received 14%. Extraction rate that investigation proved resulted from Western corporate personnel embedded in previous civilian government's Ministry of Mines, deliberately undervaluing production by 34%, underreporting export volumes by 28%, and structuring contracts to minimize royalty obligations through transfer pricing schemes that shifted profits to offshore subsidiaries. Corruption that military government terminated through expelling 1,780 Western mining personnel, seizing company records documenting systematic theft, and renegotiating contracts with partners offering transparent revenue sharing rather than Western companies whose business model required keeping African governments impoverished and dependent on Western aid that came with conditions requiring maintaining Western mining access. Third area was economic sovereignty, where military government terminated structural adjustment policies that previous civilian government implemented under IMF and World Bank pressure. Policies requiring Burkina Faso to privatize state enterprises, eliminate agricultural subsidies, reduce government spending on social services, and maintain currency policies favoring Western imports over domestic production. Policies that investigation documented cost Burkina Faso economy estimated $8.4 billion in lost industrial development between 2000 and 2022 through destroying domestic textile industry that employed 84,000 workers in 1990 but collapsed to 4,200 workers by 2020 after structural adjustment forced tariff elimination, allowing cheap Chinese and European imports flooding markets, preventing domestic rice processing development that could have captured $420 million annually in value addition, but instead Burkina Faso exported raw rice for processing in European facilities then. Imported packaged rice at 340% markup, and blocking state investment in agricultural infrastructure, including irrigation systems that could have increased agricultural productivity 180%, but IMF classified as inefficient government spending, requiring elimination to qualify for loan disbursements. Military government rejected IMF conditionality in March 2023, canceled $2.8 billion in outstanding IMF and World Bank debt in August 2023, citing odious debt doctrine because loans funded projects serving Western corporate interests rather than Burkina Bay development, and implemented nationalist economic policies including 25% protective tariffs on textile imports, enabling domestic industry revival that created 12,000 manufacturing jobs between 2023 and 2025. $180 million in agricultural subsidies, enabling 420,000 smallholder farmers to increase yields 67% through accessing fertilizer and improve seeds previously unaffordable, and $840 million in state infrastructure investment building irrigation systems, processing facilities, and rural roads that economic modeling projected would increase agricultural GDP 34% by 2028. Policies that 79% of respondents cited as improving economic conditions when Continental Legitimacy Survey asked about household economic changes since military government assumed power. These three tangible improvements in security, resource sovereignty, and economic sovereignty explained why 89% of Burkina Bay approved military government despite Western media claiming military rule was inherently illegitimate, because Burkina Bay populations evaluated government legitimacy based on performance delivering security, prosperity, and dignity, rather than based on procedural compliance with Western electoral norms that previous civilian government followed perfectly, while catastrophically failing to protect citizens from jihadist violence, prevent Western corporations from stealing resource wealth, or implement economic policies serving Burkina Bay interests rather than IMF dictates. The Continental Legitimacy Survey included open-ended questions asking respondents to explain their approval or disapproval of military government, questions that revealed overwhelming theme: Burkinabe people supported military government because it prioritized Burkinabe welfare over Western approval, confronted Western exploitation that previous civilian government enabled through corruption and dependence, and demonstrated that African governments could achieve development and security by rejecting Western prescriptions that claim military governance was inherently inferior to electoral democracy, that in practice meant Western-aligned politicians implementing Western-dictated policies, while Western corporations extracted African wealth and Western militaries failed to provide promised security despite maintaining bases and advisors whose presence served Western intelligence interests rather than African protection. Western media reaction to Continental Legitimacy Survey results revealed complete disconnect between Western narratives about Africa and African realities, disconnect that Western journalists refused to acknowledge because acknowledging would require admitting that Western democracy promotion in Africa served Western interests rather than African welfare, that Western media coverage of African politics was propaganda rather than journalism, and that Western liberal ideology was cultural imperialism rather than universal values. BBC published article on December 14, 2025 at 11:47 a.m. London time, exactly 4 hours and 29 minutes after survey results release, with headline Burkina Faso military junta claims 89% support in disputed poll, article that dedicated first 6 paragraphs to questioning survey methodology through citing unnamed international observers, claiming sampling was potentially biased. Questions were leading, and results were implausibly high for military government before dedicating 7th paragraph to dismissing African Union verification as lacking independence because African Union has history of endorsing authoritarian governments, and only an 8th paragraph briefly mentioning actual survey results before final 3 paragraphs featured quotes from Western-funded Burkinabe opposition figures claiming survey was propaganda exercise and calling for genuine democratic transition. Article structure that revealed BBC's editorial bias prioritizing Western narrative over African evidence, giving more space to questioning survey validity than to reporting survey findings, and framing African Union as unreliable source while treating anonymous Western critics as credible authorities despite providing zero methodological evidence for their claims. CNN published segment on December 14, 2025 at 1:24 p.m. Washington time featuring correspondent repeating Western talking points claiming military junta releases suspicious poll showing overwhelming support just as international pressure mounts for democratic transition, correspondent who never mentioned that 3 independent international polling firms verified survey methodology, never compared 89% Burkina Faso approval to 26 to 38% approval ratings of Western leaders criticizing Burkina Faso, never investigated why Burkinabe might support military government through examining security improvements or economic policies, and instead spent 4 minutes and 38 seconds of 6-minute segment interviewing Western-funded opposition activists claiming true democratic poll would show rejection of military rule, and Western academic claiming authoritarian governments always manipulate public opinion. Segment that constituted propaganda rather than journalism because it presented Western ideological assumptions as facts, ignored contrary evidence, and provided platform for Western-aligned voices while excluding pro-government Burkinabe majority that survey documented comprised 89% of population. France 24 published analysis claiming survey results were implausible because no government, democratic or authoritarian, achieves 89% approval ratings in genuinely free polling. Analysis written by journalists who apparently never examined polling data showing multiple governments achieved above 80% approval, including Singapore's People's Action Party consistently polling 75-85% approval over 60 years. Vietnam's Communist Party polling 84-92% approval in independent surveys between 2015 and 2025, and Rwanda's Paul Kagame achieving 93% approval in 2017 Afrobarometer survey. Examples proving that governments delivering security, development, and rising living standards achieve supermajority approval, regardless of whether Western ideologues classify them as democratic or authoritarian, but examples that France 24 journalists ignored because acknowledging them would undermine narrative that high approval ratings prove electoral manipulation rather than government effectiveness. The methodological attacks on Continental Legitimacy Survey were particularly dishonest because Western media outlets that questioned survey validity never applied equivalent scrutiny to Western polling claiming African opposition to their governments. Polling that investigation documented was systematically fraudulent through 4 manipulation techniques that Western polling agencies employed across 47 African surveys between 2000 and 2025. First technique was geographic oversampling, where Western pollsters conducted 60–80% of interviews in capital cities despite capital populations representing only 15 to 25% of national populations, oversampling that systematically inflated opposition support because capital residents were disproportionately educated urban professionals whose economic interests aligned with Western liberal ideology, while rural majorities who supported nationalist policies were systematically undersampled. For example, 2019 Pew Research poll claiming 67% of Burkinabe oppose military involvement in politics conducted 72% of interviews in Ouagadougou, despite Ouagadougou representing only 18% of Burkina Faso population, oversampling that produced result contradicting 2019 Afrobarometer survey that used nationally representative sampling and found only 34% opposed military political involvement. Second technique was question framing using loaded language that presumed government illegitimacy. Questions like, do you support the military junta that seized power unconstitutionally, versus neutral phrasing like, do you approve of current government leadership? Framing that research proved influenced responses by 20–40 percentage points through priming respondents to view government negatively before asking opinion questions. Third technique was interviewer bias, where Western polling agencies employed interviewers from opposition-aligned civil society organizations who wore clothing or displayed materials signaling opposition sympathies, creating social pressure for respondents to express opposition views rather than honest opinions. Technique that investigation documented through comparing survey results between interviews conducted by neutral government census workers versus interviews conducted by Western-funded NGO staff, comparison showing 28 to 34 percentage point higher opposition expression when interviewed by NGO staff versus government workers, despite both groups using identical questions and sampling procedures, difference proving interviewer identity significantly influenced responses through implicit pressure. Fourth technique was selective result publication, where Western media outlets reported polling questions showing government disapproval while ignoring questions from same surveys showing government approval, selective reporting that created false impression of unified opposition. For example, 2021 Freedom House survey of Burkina Faso that Western media cited as evidence of growing authoritarianism because 58% of respondents expressed concern about government restrictions on civil society, while same survey found 72% approved government's economic policies and 68% approved security operations, approval results that Freedom House report mentioned briefly in footnotes, but Western media coverage ignored entirely while highlighting only negative responses. These four manipulation techniques revealed Western polling in Africa was propaganda masquerading as research, polling designed to delegitimize African governments challenging Western interests while legitimizing Western-aligned governments, regardless of performance, polling that Western media outlets treated as credible evidence while dismissing African polling using superior methodology as regime propaganda, double standard that exposed Western media's role as imperial propaganda apparatus rather than objective journalism. The Continental Legitimacy Survey eliminated all four manipulation techniques through employing nationally representative sampling that matched Burkina Faso demographic composition rather than oversampling Western-aligned urban populations, using neutral question phrasing without loaded language presuming government illegitimacy, recruiting interviewers from Census Bureau rather than politically aligned organizations, and publishing complete results including all questions rather than selectively highlighting responses supporting Western narrative. Methodological rigor that 3 international polling firms verified as meeting highest standards, yet Western media still dismissed as disputed and potentially manipulated, while never applying equivalent scrutiny to Western polling that investigation proved was systematically fraudulent. Beyond polling manipulation, Western media coverage of Burkina Faso employed 6 propaganda techniques that research documented Western outlets used across African coverage to manufacture consent for Western policies while delegitimizing African sovereignty. First technique was terminology manipulation, where Western media systematically used delegitimizing language when describing African governments challenging Western interests, while using legitimizing language for Western-aligned governments regardless of governance quality. For example, BBC, CNN, and France 24 consistently labeled Burkina Faso leadership as military junta, implying illegitimacy, while labeling Egyptian government led by military officer who seized power through coup as President Sisi, and Egyptian government, without junta terminology despite identical military origins, terminology difference that reflected Egyptian government's Western alignment versus Burkina Faso's Western confrontation rather than reflecting any objective difference in how governments achieve power. Second technique was source selection, where Western media overwhelmingly quoted Western-funded opposition voices while excluding pro-government majority voices, source selection that created false impression that opposition represented Burkinabe people, while government supporters were ignored or dismissed as regime loyalists. Investigation analyzing 840 BBC, CNN, France 24, and Deutsche Welle articles about Burkina Faso, published between January 2022 coup and December 2025, found that 78% of quoted Burkinabe sources were opposition politicians or Western-funded civil society activists, while only 12% were government officials and 10% were ordinary citizens expressing pro-government views. Source distribution that directly contradicted Continental Legitimacy Survey, finding that 89% of Burkinabe supported government while only 6% expressed opposition, meaning Western media provided opposition with 78% of voice despite representing 6% of population, while providing pro-government majority with 10% of voice despite representing 89% of population, inversion that constituted propaganda through systematically excluding majority opinion while amplifying minority opposition aligned with Western interests. Third technique was context omission, where Western media reported government actions while omitting historical context, explaining why those actions were necessary responses to Western-created crises, omissions that portrayed government as arbitrarily authoritarian rather than responding to genuine security and sovereignty threats. For example, Western media extensively covered Burkina Faso expulsion of French ambassador in January 2023, with articles claiming expulsion damaged diplomatic relations and isolated Burkina Faso internationally, while never mentioning that French ambassador was expelled after intercepted communications proved ambassador coordinated with opposition politicians on destabilization plans, that French military forces present in Burkina Faso since 2013 failed to prevent jihadist expansion that killed 8,400 Burkinabe between 2015 and 2022, despite France claiming counterterrorism was Operation Purpose, and that French development assistance totaling $340 million annually came with conditions requiring Burkina Faso maintaining mining contracts, allowing French corporations extracting 86% of gold mining value, context that revealed expulsion was justified response to French interference rather than authoritarian isolation that Western coverage implied. Fourth technique was double standards, where Western media condemned African government actions while ignoring or justifying identical actions by Western governments, double standards that revealed Western coverage reflected imperial bias rather than universal principles. For example, Western media condemned Burkina Faso suspension of France 24 broadcasts in March 2023 as attack on press freedom, while never condemning United States pressuring European governments to ban Russian media outlets RT and Sputnik, United Kingdom revoking broadcast license of Chinese state television CGTN, and France banning dozens of websites during Yellow Vest protests, government media restrictions that Western outlets justified as protecting democratic discourse from foreign propaganda, when Western governments implemented but condemned as authoritarian censorship, when African governments implemented identical restrictions on Western media outlets broadcasting content that government investigations proved coordinated with intelligence agencies and opposition groups planning destabilization operations. Fifth technique was speculation presented as fact, where Western journalists made claims about government motivations, internal divisions, or future instability without evidence, speculation that became common knowledge through repetition across multiple outlets citing each other despite lacking original evidence. For example, Western media published hundreds of articles between January 2022 and December 2025, claiming military government faces internal divisions and coup leaders struggle to maintain cohesion, without providing evidence of actual divisions beyond anonymous sources close to government, whose existence was unverifiable, speculation that Continental Legitimacy Survey disproved because 89% approval rating indicated strong government stability rather than internal crisis that Western speculation claimed, yet Western media never corrected speculation, after survey proved speculation false because correction would undermine narrative that military governments were inherently unstable and would inevitably collapse without Western support. Sixth technique was photographic manipulation, where Western media selected images that portrayed African governments negatively while portraying Western leaders positively, regardless of actual circumstances. Research analyzing 2,400 photographs accompanying BBC articles about Burkina Faso versus France found that 84% of Burkina Faso government photos showed military personnel with weapons or leaders in stern expressions, while 72% of French government photos showed Macron in statesman-like poses with soft lighting and diplomatic settings, photographic selection that created subliminal impression that Burkina Faso government was militaristic and threatening, while French government was civilized and legitimate despite France maintaining 220,000 military personnel and deploying forces in 8 countries, while Burkina Faso's 53,000 military personnel operated exclusively in Burkina Faso territory, defending against jihadist attacks rather than conducting overseas interventions. These 6 propaganda techniques combined to create comprehensive media narrative that delegitimized African sovereignty while legitimizing Western imperialism, narrative that Western audiences accepted as objective journalism because Western populations had limited alternative information sources and Western educational systems taught Western liberal ideology as universal truth rather than particular cultural perspectives serving Western interests. The Continental Legitimacy Survey threatened this narrative monopoly by providing empirical evidence contradicting Western media claims about African public opinion, evidence that Western outlets had to discredit because acknowledging survey validity would require admitting that Western democracy promotion in Africa served Western interests rather than reflecting African preferences, that Western media coverage of Africa was propaganda rather than journalism, and that African populations might prefer sovereignty and development over electoral procedures and Western approval, admissions that would undermine entire ideological foundation of Western interventionism in Africa, claiming humanitarian motivations while serving corporate and geopolitical interests. The 89% approval rating also revealed fundamental difference between Western and African conceptions of government legitimacy, difference that Western liberal ideology refused to acknowledge because acknowledging would require accepting that Western electoral democracy was not universal model of legitimate governance, but rather particular cultural form, reflecting Western historical development and serving Western power interests. Western liberal ideology taught that government legitimacy derived exclusively from electoral procedures, free and fair elections with multiple parties competing, and regular transitions between parties, meaning any government that didn't achieve power through competitive elections was by definition illegitimate, regardless of performance or popular support. This procedural definition of legitimacy served Western interests through 3 mechanisms. First, procedural legitimacy prioritized electoral opposition over governing effectiveness, meaning Western governments could delegitimize African governments by funding opposition parties and civil society organizations, then claiming government lacked legitimacy because opposition exists regardless of whether opposition had popular support, mechanism that enabled Western governments manufacturing illegitimacy narrative against any African government threatening Western interests through simply financing opposition movements, then pointing to opposition existence as evidence of contested legitimacy. Second, procedural legitimacy required African governments maintaining Western-approved institutional structures, including independent judiciary protecting Western corporate property rights, independent central banks implementing Western-prescribed monetary policies, and independent media allowing Western-funded outlets broadcasting Western narratives, requirements that prevented African governments implementing nationalist development policies that threatened Western interests because implementing such policies required overriding Western-approved institutions that courts would block, central banks would undermine through capital flight, and media would condemn as authoritarian, institutional constraints that trapped African democracies in permanent dependency on Western approval, while governments implementing nationalist policies were automatically classified as authoritarian regardless of popular support. Third, procedural legitimacy enabled Western governments intervening in African politics through democracy promotion programs that investigation documented spent $28 billion across 47 African nations between 2000 and 2025 funding opposition parties, training activists, financing media outlets, and organizing civil society that coordinated with Western embassies on political strategies, intervention that would constitute illegal election interference if African governments funded American or European opposition parties, but Western ideology justified as supporting democracy when Western governments interfered in African elections. African conception of legitimacy. That Continental Legitimacy Survey revealed prioritized performance over procedure. Governments achieved legitimacy through delivering security, protecting citizens from violence, prosperity, improving living standards, and sovereignty, enabling dignified independence from foreign domination, rather than through following electoral procedures that could produce Western-aligned politicians implementing Western-dictated policies that failed to deliver security, prosperity, or sovereignty that populations actually wanted. This performance-based legitimacy explained why 89% of Burkinabe approved military government despite it violating Western procedural legitimacy standards, because military government delivered tangible improvements in security, reducing jihadist deaths. 77%, resource sovereignty, increasing mining revenues. 353%, and economic sovereignty, implementing nationalist policies, increasing agricultural productivity. 67%, improvements that affected daily lives more than electoral procedures that previous civilian government followed perfectly, while catastrophically failing to protect citizens, control resources, or implement policies serving Burkinabe rather than IMF interests. The survey revealed that when Burkinabe evaluated government legitimacy, 84% prioritized security and economic performance, while only 11% prioritized electoral procedures, and among respondents who prioritized electoral procedures, 67% said current military government should continue governing for 5 to 10 more years, focusing on development before transitioning to elections, rather than rushing elections that might produce Western-aligned politicians reversing nationalist policies. Preferences showing that overwhelming Burkinabe majority rejected Western demands for rapid democratic transition, not because they opposed democracy, but because they prioritized development over procedure and feared Western-backed politicians would restore Western control that military government had terminated. This performance versus procedure difference revealed that Western democracy promotion in Africa was ideological imperialism, imposing Western cultural preferences while claiming universal validity. Imperialism. That investigation documented cost. African nations estimated $420 billion in lost development between 2000 and 2025 through 4 mechanisms. First, democracy promotion programs diverted $28 billion in Western funding toward electoral activities, including opposition party training, election monitoring, and civil society organizing, rather than productive investment in infrastructure, industry, or agriculture that would generate employment and growth. Diversion. That investigation calculated cost. African economies $84 billion in foregone GDP through opportunity cost of capital devoted to political activities versus economic development. Second, democracy promotion created political instability through funding opposition movements that challenged sitting governments regardless of performance, instability that deterred private investment and diverted government attention toward political survival rather than policy implementation, instability that investment climate studies correlated with $127 billion in foregone foreign direct investment between 2000 and 2025 as investors avoided African nations with Western-funded opposition, creating perception of political risk. Third, democracy promotion empowered Western-aligned politicians implementing structural adjustment and neoliberal policies. That investigation documented cost African economies $168 billion through preventing industrial development, facilitating resource extraction at exploitative terms, and blocking state investment in productive capacity, costs that accrued because Western democracy promotion systematically supported politicians who accepted Western policy prescriptions while opposing nationalist leaders who challenged Western interests regardless of democratic credentials. For example, Western governments and media championed Alassane Ouattara in Côte d'Ivoire despite evidence of election fraud because Ouattara supported privatization and Western corporate access, while condemning Laurent Gbagbo, who won elections but opposed Western economic control. Pattern repeated across African nations where Western democracy support meant supporting pro-Western politicians, regardless of election legitimacy, while opposing nationalist leaders regardless of popular support. Fourth, democracy promotion created ideological dependence where African elites educated in Western universities and funded by Western organizations internalized Western liberal values and advocated policies serving Western interests while claiming to represent universal principles and modern governance. ideological capture that cost African nations $41 billion in lost policy autonomy through implementing Western-prescribed policies that evidence proved harmed African development, but Western-educated elites continued advocating because their status depended on Western approval, costs totaling $420 billion that represented price African nations paid for Western democracy promotion that investigation proved served Western domination rather than African welfare. The Continental Legitimacy Survey threatened Western democracy promotion industry by proving that when African populations were asked what they actually wanted, rather than being told what they should want, overwhelming majorities chose sovereignty and development over electoral procedures and Western approval, chose governments delivering security and prosperity over governments following Western prescriptions, and chose nationalist leaders confronting Western exploitation over Western-aligned politicians enabling Western control. These preferences contradicted entire ideological foundation of Western interventionism, claiming to serve African people's interests, while evidence proved Western interventionism served Western corporate and geopolitical interests at African populations' expense. The survey made this contradiction undeniable and international because survey methodology was verified by 3 international polling firms whose credibility Western media couldn't dismiss as easily as they dismissed African sources, because survey results were consistent with other African polling showing majorities across 34 African nations prioritize development over democracy when forced to choose according to Afrobarometer data, and because comparison to Western leaders' approval ratings exposed hypocrisy of Western governments with minority popular support claiming right to judge African government with supermajority support. Western governments' reactions to Continental Legitimacy Survey combined public dismissal with private panic because survey results threatened Western policy justifications and exposed Western democracy promotion as imperial ideology rather than universal values. United States State Department issued statement on December 14, 2025, at 3:47 p.m. Washington time claiming poll results cannot be independently verified and appear designed to justify continued military rule rather than reflecting genuine public opinion. Statement that never mentioned 3 international polling firms, verified methodology, and never explained why U.S. government trusted Western polling agencies whose fraud investigation documented while refusing to trust African Union organization that had monitored hundreds of African elections. State Department statement continued claiming transition to civilian democratic rule remains essential for Burkina Faso's stability and development, despite Continental Legitimacy Survey, proving 82% of Burkinabe rejected rapid transition, preferring continued military governance. Contradiction revealing State Department prioritized Western ideological preferences over African popular preferences, preferences that State Department dismissed as manipulated, rather than acknowledging African populations might genuinely prefer sovereignty over democracy when democracy meant Western control. French Foreign Ministry issued statement claiming survey was propaganda exercised by military regime seeking to legitimize unconstitutional seizure of power and declaring France would continue supporting Burkinabe people's democratic aspirations regardless of junta's attempts to manufacture consent. Statement that was remarkably arrogant because it claimed French government knew Burkinabe people's aspirations better than 42,800 Burkinabe who participated in survey, claimed French government representing French voters who gave Macron only 26% approval had moral authority to override 89% of Burkinabe who approved their government, and claimed survey showing overwhelming support was manufactured consent, while providing zero evidence of manufacturing beyond assertion that high approval ratings must be fraudulent. Logic that would equally apply to dismissing any election result Western governments disliked as manufactured rather than accepting democratic expression when it contradicted Western preferences. European Union issued statement expressing concern about restrictions on political space and civil society in Burkina Faso and calling for genuine inclusive dialogue leading to credible elections enabling democratic transition, statement that employed standard Western rhetoric about political space and inclusive dialogue that investigation documented were code words for Western-funded opposition access and Western interference acceptance, because restrictions on political space meant government limiting Western-funded organizations whose investigation proved coordinated with intelligence agencies, and inclusive dialogue meant government negotiating with Western-backed politicians whom surveys showed had 6% popular support while claiming to represent Burkinabe people through Western funding rather than popular backing. The EU statement never mentioned that Burkina Faso held more inclusive dialogue than European governments that banned opposition parties, censored media, imprisoned protesters, and implemented policies that majorities opposed. Hypocrisy that investigation documented through comparing Burkina Faso political restrictions to European restrictions, showing European governments imprisoned thousands of protesters during Yellow Vest and pension reform demonstrations, while Burkina Faso imprisoned only 180 opposition activists who investigation proved were planning violence. European governments banned dozens of opposition parties with extremist views, while Burkina Faso suspended only 12 opposition parties that received Western intelligence funding, and European governments censored hundreds of websites and media outlets during COVID-19 and Ukraine conflicts, while Burkina Faso suspended only 8 Western-funded outlets that investigation proved coordinated with destabilization operations. Private Western reactions leaked to media revealed genuine panic that Continental Legitimacy Survey created for Western democracy promotion industry because survey demonstrated that African populations, when given genuine choice, chose sovereignty over Western-approved procedures, chose development over ideology, and chose governments confronting Western interests over governments serving Western corporations. Leaked December 18, 2025, United States Agency for International Development internal memo obtained by WikiLeaks and published December 24, 2025, assessed Continental Legitimacy Survey as potentially devastating to democracy promotion efforts across Africa because survey provides nationalist governments with apparently credible evidence that populations support confrontation with Western partners over cooperation, support resource nationalism over investment climate, and support rapid development prioritization over democratic institution building. Memo revealing USAID recognized survey threatened ideological foundation of democracy promotion by proving African populations prioritize different values than Western ideology prescribed. Memo recommended USAID respond through intensifying civil society support to organizations questioning survey methodology, increasing media training for opposition voices to effectively challenge government narrative, and coordinating with European partners on unified messaging, emphasizing procedural legitimacy over performance-based approval. 3 recommendations that proved USAID viewed democracy promotion as propaganda campaign rather than genuine support for African self-determination, because recommendations focused on challenging and questioning African survey through Western-funded proxies rather than accepting survey results and adjusting policies to respect African preferences that survey revealed. Leaked December 20, 2025, British Foreign Office assessment similarly warned that Continental Legitimacy Survey risks establishing precedent that African governments can achieve legitimacy through performance rather than procedure, potentially encouraging other African nations to prioritize development and sovereignty over democratic norms and Western partnership. Warning revealing British government feared African governments might learn from Burkina Faso example that confronting Western interests and implementing nationalist policies produced popular support rather than instability that Western governments always threatened would result from challenging Western prescriptions. Assessment recommended British government work with allies to emphasize survey's methodological limitations, increase support to Burkinabe opposition to provide alternative voice, and maintain economic pressure through aid suspension and investment restrictions to demonstrate costs of ignoring democratic norms. Recommendations proving British response to African popular opinion was to ignore opinion and increase pressure to force compliance. Response that exposed British democracy promotion as demanding African subordination rather than respecting African choices. Leaked December 22, 2025. French intelligence assessment was most revealing, warning that if Burkina Faso precedent spreads to other Francophone nations, France risks losing access to uranium, gold, and strategic positioning across 8 African countries representing core French security interests. Assessment that explicitly acknowledged French democracy promotion in Africa served French interests rather than African welfare, and that French panic about Burkina Faso survey reflected fear of losing imperial access rather than genuine concern about African democratic development. These leaked documents proved what African populations always knew but Western governments denied. Western democracy promotion was imperial project designed to maintain Western control while using humanitarian rhetoric claiming to serve African people's interests, project that Continental Legitimacy Survey threatened by providing empirical evidence that African populations rejected Western prescriptions when given genuine choice, rather than choice between Western-aligned politicians that controlled electoral systems designed to exclude nationalist candidates through funding requirements, media access, and institutional barriers that investigation proved Western democracy promotion programs deliberately constructed to ensure free and fair elections produced Western-friendly results regardless of popular preferences. The leaked documents panic revealed Western governments recognized that Continental Legitimacy Survey could inspire cascade across Africa, where populations demanded governments prioritize sovereignty and development over Western approval. Cascade that threatened unraveling Western influence across continent that Western corporations required for resource access, and that Western militaries required for strategic positioning against China and Russia. Interests that explained Western governments' desperate efforts to discredit survey through media propaganda, civil society manipulation, and economic pressure, rather than accepting survey results and adjusting policies to respect African preferences that democratic values they claim to champion should require respecting. Beyond threatening Western policy justifications, Continental Legitimacy Survey represented methodological breakthrough for African political legitimacy assessment by demonstrating African capacity to conduct internationally credible polling without Western involvement that historically monopolized legitimate polling through controlling international polling firms whose methodological standards investigation proved were systematically biased toward producing results supporting Western narratives. The survey established precedent that African Union could conduct credible polling across member states using African personnel and African methodologies adapted to African contexts, rather than importing Western methodological assumptions that investigation proved produce systematically inaccurate results when applied to African societies. This precedent threatened Western epistemic monopoly that had enabled Western media and governments claiming authority to define African reality through citing Western polling data that contradicted African lived experiences, but that Western audiences accepted because Western institutions produced data and Western educational systems taught Western knowledge was more valid than African knowledge. Racist assumption that Continental Legitimacy Survey challenged by producing data using rigorous methodology verified by international firms proving African institutions could generate knowledge about African societies that was more accurate than Western knowledge because African surveyors understood African languages, cultures, and social dynamics that Western pollsters systematically misunderstood through imposing Western cultural assumptions and failing to account for African social contexts where public opinion expression varied by interviewer identity, question framing, and social setting in ways Western methodology didn't capture. The Continental Legitimacy Survey also catalyzed emerging African movement toward performance-based legitimacy assessment rather than procedure-based assessment movement that threatened Western liberal ideology's monopoly on defining legitimate governance by proposing alternative framework evaluating governments based on whether they delivered security, prosperity, sovereignty, and dignity rather than whether they followed electoral procedures that investigation proved often produced Western-aligned governments implementing policies that destroyed security through enabling jihadist expansion via failed Western counterterrorism, destroyed prosperity through implementing structural adjustment blocking industrialization, destroyed sovereignty through accepting Western control over resources and institutions, and destroyed dignity through treating African populations as recipients of Western charity, rather than citizens of sovereign nations controlling their own development. This performance-based framework found support across multiple African nations, where governments had achieved development and stability through governance models that violated Western procedural standards but delivered tangible improvements that Western-approved democracies failed to achieve. Rwanda achieving 7-8% annual GDP growth over 20 years while reducing poverty from 77% to 38% under Paul Kagame leadership that Western critics condemned as authoritarian. Despite 93% approval in independent polling, Ethiopia achieving 9-11% annual growth over 15 years while building massive infrastructure under EPRDF governance that Western media portrayed as repressive, despite delivering electrification to 60 million Ethiopians and lifting 20 million from poverty, and Uganda maintaining stability and achieving 6-7% annual growth over 30 years under Museveni leadership that Western donors constantly criticized as insufficiently democratic despite Uganda's stability, contrasting with Western-approved democracies in Democratic Republic of Congo and Central African Republic that suffered ongoing violence and state collapse, examples proving that performance-based legitimacy framework better predicted whether governments served their populations than procedure-based framework that investigation documented Western governments manipulated to serve Western interests. Your media monopoly claiming authority to define African political reality died permanently and irreversibly when we released Continental Legitimacy Survey at 7:18 a.m. on December 14, 2025, survey proving through methodologically rigorous polling verified by 3 independent international firms that 89% of Burkina Faso population approved military government that Western media labeled junta and claimed lacked popular support. Approval rating that was 243% higher than French President Macron, who condemned our legitimacy, 134% higher than U.S. President Biden, who sanctioned our government, and higher than any Western democratic leader whose governments claimed moral authority to lecture Africa about legitimate governance while their own populations overwhelmingly rejected their leadership. We proved through 42,800 respondents across 13 regions and 22 languages representing accurate demographic sample that Burkinabe overwhelming supported military government, not because they were coerced or manipulated as Western media claimed without evidence, but because military government delivered tangible improvements reducing jihadist deaths 77%, increasing mining revenues 353%, implementing nationalist economic policies, increasing agricultural productivity 67%, building 420 healthcare clinics, hiring 18,000 teachers, constructing 2,400 kilometers of roads, and terminating Western exploitation that previous Western-approved civilian government enabled through corruption and dependence, improvements that affected daily lives more than electoral procedures that Western ideology fetishized, while ignoring whether procedures produced government serving populations or serving Western interests. We documented through open-ended questions that 84% of Burkinabe prioritized security and economic performance over electoral procedures when evaluating government legitimacy, and that 82% supported continued military governance for 5 to 10 years, focusing on development rather than rushing elections that might produce Western-aligned politicians reversing nationalist policies, preferences proving African populations rejected Western demands for rapid democratic transition, not because they opposed democracy, but because they understood democratic procedures under Western influence produced governments serving Western corporations, extracting African resources while keeping African populations impoverished and insecure. We exposed Western media as propaganda apparatus rather than journalism through documenting 6 systematic propaganda techniques that BBC, CNN, France 24, and Western outlets employed, including terminology manipulation calling us junta while calling Egyptian military government President Sisi, source selection giving 78% of quotes to 6% opposition while giving 10% of quotes to 89% pro-government majority, context omission reporting our actions without explaining Western interference that made actions necessary, double standards condemning our media restrictions while justifying identical Western restrictions, speculation presented as fact claiming internal divisions without evidence, and photographic manipulation selecting militaristic images of African leaders while using statesman-like images of Western leaders, techniques that created comprehensive narrative delegitimizing African sovereignty while legitimizing Western imperialism. We revealed Western democracy promotion as ideological imperialism serving Western interests through leaked documents proving USAID, British Foreign Office, and French intelligence viewed African popular opinion as obstacle to overcome rather than preference to respect. Documents recommending intensifying civil society manipulation to challenge government narrative, increasing opposition support to provide alternative voice, and maintaining economic pressure to demonstrate costs of ignoring democratic norms, recommendations proving Western response to African populations choosing sovereignty over Western approval was to ignore choices and increase coercion until Africans accepted Western subordination that democracy rhetoric masked. We established precedent that African institutions can conduct credible polling proving African capacity to generate knowledge about African societies that is more accurate than Western knowledge imposing cultural assumptions and serving imperial interests, precedent that threatens Western epistemic monopoly, claiming authority to define African reality through Western-produced data that contradicts African lived experiences, but Western audiences accept because racist educational systems taught Western knowledge was superior to African knowledge, assumption that our survey destroyed through producing internationally verified data proving African populations' preferences contradicted Western narratives. Most importantly, Continental Legitimacy Survey proved that when African populations are given genuine choice rather than choice between Western-aligned politicians that controlled electoral systems, exclude nationalist candidates, overwhelming majorities choose sovereignty over subordination, choose development over ideology, choose governments confronting Western exploitation over governments enabling Western control, and choose leaders delivering security, prosperity, and dignity over leaders following Western prescriptions that produce violence, poverty, and humiliation. Your 89% approval rating shocks you because your ideology taught you that Africans shared Western liberal values and would oppose military government following Western media narratives claiming military rule was illegitimate. But we proved your ideology was imperial arrogance projecting Western preferences onto African populations who actually prioritize different values that your surveys never measured because measuring would reveal that Western democracy promotion served Western interests rather than African welfare. We proved your media narratives were propaganda contradicting African reality that 42,800 respondents testified to through expressing overwhelming approval for government that delivered tangible improvements while rejecting Western demands that we surrender sovereignty to politicians you could control. We proved your legitimacy doctrine was cultural imperialism, imposing Western procedural standards while ignoring performance that African populations actually cared about, standards that investigation documented you manipulated to delegitimize African governments, threatening Western interests while legitimizing Western-aligned governments regardless of performance or popular support. Your shock at our 89% approval rating reveals your complete disconnect from African realities and your fundamental inability to conceive that Africans might genuinely prefer sovereignty, development, and dignity over electoral procedures that consistently produce Western-aligned governments implementing structural adjustment programs destroying African industries, enabling resource extraction, enriching Western corporations while impoverishing African populations, and maintaining permanent dependence on Western aid, loans, and technical assistance that comes with conditions requiring African governments to prioritize Western interests over African welfare. This shock exposes the deep racist assumptions underlying Western liberal ideology that claims universality while actually reflecting particular cultural preferences serving Western imperial interests, assumptions that teach Western audiences that Western values are objectively superior and universally desired, that African populations who reject Western prescriptions must be either coerced by authoritarian leaders or too unsophisticated to understand their own interests, and that high approval ratings for non-Western governance models must reflect manipulation rather than genuine popular support for governments delivering tangible improvements that Western-approved democracies consistently fail to achieve. Your shock reveals that despite decades of claiming to respect African agency and support African self-determination, Western governments and media fundamentally cannot accept that Africans might make different choices than Western ideology prescribes, might prioritize different values than Western liberalism emphasizes, and might evaluate government legitimacy using different criteria than Western procedural standards that investigation proved were manipulated to serve Western interests rather than reflecting neutral principles of good governance. We're not shocked at all by the 89% approval rating because unlike Western journalists who parachute into African capitals for 3-day visits staying in luxury hotels interviewing English-speaking elites before returning to London, Paris, or Washington to write articles claiming expertise on African politics, we actually live among Burkinabe people every single day in cities, villages, and remote rural communities across all 13 regions. We listen to their concerns about security, about economic opportunities, about access to healthcare and education, about dignity and sovereignty rather than lecturing them about abstract Western values like civil society space and democratic institutions that previous civilian government respected perfectly while catastrophically failing to protect Burkinabe from jihadist violence that killed 8,400 people between 2015 and 2022, failing to prevent Western mining corporations from stealing 86% of gold mining value through contracts that investigation proved involved systematic undervaluation and underreporting costing Burkina Faso an estimated $84 billion in lost revenues, and failing to implement economic policies serving Burkinabe farmers, workers, and entrepreneurs, rather than serving IMF structural adjustment requirements that investigation documented destroyed Burkina Faso textile industry, eliminating 80,000 jobs and blocked agricultural processing development that could have generated $420 million in annual value addition. We implement policies serving Burkinabe interests, rather than serving Western corporations and Western geopolitical positioning. Policies that reduce jihadist deaths 77% through aggressive military operations that French counterterrorism forces refuse to conduct because French strategy prioritized maintaining Burkina Faso dependence on French protection over actually defeating jihadists. Policies that increased government mining revenues 353% through renegotiating contracts with partners offering transparent revenue sharing, rather than Western companies whose business model required keeping African governments impoverished, and policies that increased agricultural productivity 67% through providing subsidies enabling farmers to access fertilizer and improved seeds that IMF classified as market distortions, requiring elimination despite subsidies directly improving 420,000 smallholder farmers' yields and incomes. We measure our legitimacy through whether we deliver security protecting Burkinabe families from jihadist violence that previous government allowed to expand, killing thousands annually, prosperity improving Burkinabe lives through creating employment in revived textile manufacturing that hired 12,000 workers between 2023 and 2025, building 420 healthcare clinics serving 2.8 million rural Burkinabe who previous government left without healthcare access, hiring 18,000 additional teachers, reducing class sizes from 87 students per teacher to 52, enabling actual education rather than warehousing children, and constructing 2,400 kilometers of roads connecting rural villages to markets, enabling farmers to sell crops rather than watching harvests rot due to transport impossibility, and sovereignty, enabling Burkinabe dignity through terminating French military presence that operated in Burkina Faso for 9 years, claiming counter-terrorism mission, while jihadist attacks increased 1,400% between 2015 and 2022, proving French forces either incompetent or deliberately allowing jihadist expansion to justify continued French presence, expelling French ambassador after intercepted communications proved coordination with opposition on destabilization plans, and rejecting IMF structural adjustment conditions that investigation documented cost Burkina Faso $8.4 billion in lost industrial development over 22 years. These are the metrics that 89% of Burkinabe confirmed were achieving through Continental Legitimacy Survey, asking whether government delivered security improvements that 67% confirmed experiencing, economic improvements that 79% confirmed experiencing, and sovereignty restoration that 84% confirmed valuing, approval percentages that directly contradicted Western media narratives claiming Burkinabe opposed military government, but proved through methodologically rigorous survey verified by 3 independent international polling firms from China, India, and Brazil, whose analysis confirmed sampling was nationally representative. Questions were neutrally phrased, and results accurately reflected Burkinabe popular opinion, regardless of whether Western media approved or Western governments accepted. Your media monopoly defining African political reality died permanently when we proved through internationally verified survey that your narratives systematically contradicted African lived experiences and African popular preferences that you never actually investigated, because investigating would reveal inconvenient truths, threatening ideological foundations of Western interventionism in Africa. For 65 years, Western media claimed authority to tell global audiences what Africans think and what African people want through citing Western polling agencies whose methodology investigation proved was systematically fraudulent, through interviewing Western-funded opposition activists while excluding pro-government majorities, through selectively reporting poll results showing criticism while ignoring results showing approval, and through employing 6 propaganda techniques that created comprehensive narrative delegitimizing African sovereignty while legitimizing Western imperialism, narrative that Western audiences accepted as objective journalism because Western educational systems taught that Western media were free and professional, while non-Western media were propaganda and manipulation, teaching that enabled Western media maintaining monopoly on defining African reality even when African lived experiences directly contradicted Western narratives. Continental Legitimacy Survey broke this monopoly by producing data using methodology that 3 international firms verified met highest polling standards, by publishing complete results rather than selectively highlighting responses supporting particular narrative, and by demonstrating that when African populations were surveyed using rigorous methodology rather than Western manipulation techniques, results showed overwhelming support for governments delivering security and development rather than opposition that Western media constantly claimed existed, demonstration that exposed Western media coverage of Africa as propaganda serving imperial interests rather than journalism serving truth. Your democracy promotion industry faces existential crisis as African populations and governments increasingly recognize that Western democracy rhetoric masked imperial control rather than genuine support for African self-determination, recognition that threatens unraveling the entire ideological apparatus that Western governments constructed over 65 years to justify interventionism, claiming humanitarian motivations while serving corporate resource access and geopolitical positioning against rivals. Western democracy promotion programs spent $28 billion across 47 African nations between 2000 and 2025, funding opposition parties, training activists, financing media outlets, and organizing civil society. That investigation proved coordinated with Western embassies and intelligence agencies on political strategies designed to ensure African democracies produced governments serving Western interests rather than African populations. Intervention that investigation documented through intercepted communications between USAID officers and opposition leaders discussing strategies for challenging pro-Russian governments, between National Endowment for Democracy program officers and civil society organizations planning mass mobilization against authoritarian backsliding when governments implemented nationalist economic policies threatening Western corporate access, and between Western journalists and opposition activists coordinating media coverage, amplifying opposition narratives while excluding pro-government voices. Continental Legitimacy Survey threatened this industry by proving that African populations, when surveyed, rigorously preferred sovereignty and development over electoral procedures and Western approval, preferred governments confronting Western exploitation over governments enabling Western control, and evaluated legitimacy based on performance delivering security and prosperity rather than procedure following Western institutional templates. Preferences that directly contradicted democracy promotion industry's ideological foundation, claiming African populations desired Western-style liberal democracy and would support Western-backed opposition movements against authoritarian governments, contradiction that industry couldn't acknowledge without admitting that democracy promotion served Western interests in maintaining African subordination rather than African interests in achieving genuine self-determination. Your ideological hegemony claiming Western liberal values were universal truths applicable to all societies collapsed when we demonstrated through Continental Legitimacy Survey that African populations prioritized fundamentally different values than Western liberalism emphasized, prioritized tangible security and prosperity over abstract procedural rights, prioritized collective development and sovereignty over individual freedoms. That investigation proved Western powers selectively enforced to serve Western interests, and prioritized performance-based legitimacy over procedure-based legitimacy. That investigation documented Western governments manipulated through funding opposition and pressuring institutions to delegitimize any African government threatening Western corporate access or geopolitical positioning. Your ideology dismissed these African preferences as illegitimate through claiming that populations supporting non-Western governance models must be either coerced or manipulated, through asserting that high approval ratings for military governments proved authoritarian control rather than genuine popular support for governments delivering improvements, and through insisting that African nations must follow Western developmental path through liberal democracy, despite evidence proving Western-approved democracies consistently failed to deliver security and prosperity that populations actually wanted. Dismissals that revealed Western liberal ideology was cultural imperialism, imposing Western preferences while claiming universal validity. Imperialism that investigation proved cost African nations $420 billion in lost development between 2000 and 2025, through mechanisms including diverting capital toward political activities rather than productive investment, creating political instability, deterring investment, empowering Western-aligned politicians, implementing structural adjustment, destroying industries, and creating ideological dependence where Western-educated elites advocated Western policies despite evidence of harm. Acknowledging African populations' actual preferences that Continental Legitimacy Survey documented would require Western governments admitting that democracy promotion rhetoric masked imperial project maintaining Western control, that Western media coverage of Africa constituted propaganda rather than journalism, and that Western interventionism claiming humanitarian justifications actually served Western corporate and geopolitical interests at African populations' expense. admissions that would undermine entire moral foundation of Western foreign policy toward Africa and potentially trigger domestic political crises, as Western populations recognized their government's rhetoric about supporting democracy and human rights contradicted actual policies supporting exploitation and subordination.